We're all set, Joy?
Yes, and I don't show any attendees are on yet. Maybe just give it a minute.
All right.
There you go. There's one. Allison.
There's a bunch.
Okay.
Okay, we'll call this meeting to order. Budget and Personnel Committee of Monterey One Water here at Friday, May 10th, 2024. 11:36, 11:37 a.m. We'll start with roll call, please.
Monterey. Castroville.
Here.
Delray Oaks.
Here.
Marina Coast.
Here.
Sand City. We do have a quorum.
Okay. Now, do we have any additions to our agenda today? From staff,
No additions.
anything from board? Any public comment?
Move approval of the current agenda.
Thank you.
Second.
Second, we got a motion and second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries unanimous. Move the agenda. Now's the time for public comments. Anything that's not listed on today's agenda? We have any public comments? See any?
See any raised hands from the
Okay.
public?
Moving to item 6, consider approval of the Budget Personnel Committee minutes of April 12th, 2024.
So moved. Second.
Any public comments on our minutes? Call, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, and the motion carries unanimous. All right, item 7, preliminary summary of the proposed draft fiscal year 24-25 wastewater budget. Fred?
It'll be Fred. I'm just going to do a brief introduction if that's okay. So as you know, we've been working on our budget for a number of months now. The presentation you received a few months ago on our capital improvement projects that increased dramatically based on a more detailed look at our needs sort of changed our budget perspective, and Fred will get into that. The increase in projects necessitates probably some sort of debt issuance over the next 5 years or so. So without knowing what the board's temperature is on additional debt or rate increases beyond the existing Prop 218, Fred has a couple different looks at it. One is, okay, if we take on debt, our debt costs go up per year. So therefore there's a required increase, potentially a required increase for rates in those out years. So the board would be saying, we're willing to commit to some level of rate increase. The other option, as we put together this 2-year budget, is no, you know what, let's keep the debt cost the same in those out years, reducing the amount we can actually encumber, and we'd have to go back and change the CIP, reduce it by, I think Fred has about $60 million reduction. So there are some pivot points that we're looking for board input on that Fred will get into. For the presentation of the board meeting, we would like some more direction, because certainly from the 23rd through June 3rd, that's a quick turnaround to redo the budget based on some of these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of information to go over, but I just wanted to sort of put a spotlight on that one, because that is a discussion point for the board. And with that, unless there's any questions, I'd like Fred to kick us off.
Through the chair. Just a quick question. We may not like it, but I just want to make sure all the alternatives are on the table. Isn't there an alternative of bigger rate increases now to avoid encumbering our ratepayers with future loan costs?
So that could be on the table. Obviously, we looked at it from the standpoint of we have an existing Prop 218 that lasts, the increases are for this year and for next year, and to ride that out. The one for this year, we can't really change it right now. I guess you could do it and it could be effective in August or September, but certainly the 5th year of our existing one, we could look to increase if need be. Because if I'm not mistaken, and I'll let Fred give me the exact numbers, as you remember, it was a fairly significant increase, and we had, based on the information 5 years ago, sort of gone to a steady state of 6% in future years. So next year, so budget year 25, 26, I think that it's projected to be 6% increase, which we do know between power increases, power and everything else, things are far greater than that, even though CPI is lower at the 2.4% plus or minus. So short answer is yes, Tom. Longer answer is we're in the Prop 218 and that last year is 6%. So that is something that we should probably have a discussion about.
I suppose if we felt really compelled to do something, you can always do a Prop 218 before your current 5-year Prop 218 is up.
Yes, absolutely can.
That also, Prop 218 processes are not free.
No.
They cost staff time and money and postage and printing, etc. So presumably, if you're going to ask us, do we want to burden our ratepayers with additional financing costs at some point in the future, which would mean rates go up, versus do we cut back on our CIP? I would expect my fellow board members would, in trying to go through the decision-making regarding that, would want to know what CIP projects would we postpone and what's the danger? What is the level of danger there? How old is that project? What are the results of some sort of failure there that might require immediate, unplanned, responsive maintenance? And what might that cost? And so forth. So just sort of previewing what board members might want to know to
and certainly
balance that.
We would want to do that to say, what is that level of service decrease in theory or potential decrease or the increase in risk? We don't have that information today. What we do have, what Fred has put together, is what the financial implications of the reduced debt service and potential rate increases.
Anything good?
So a couple questions real quick is to look between issuing debt versus postponing CIP. I think somebody mentioned either at the last board meeting or at the last budget meeting that we have some debt we're retiring soon.
Mhm.
So theoretically, reissuance wouldn't be a huge hit to the budget. And if we issued beyond that, would we have issues with bond covenants and reserves?
So we do have some debt that's coming off the books in 26. It's not that big, but it's something. The plan that we presented to the board last year and the year before was when that debt drops off to still have that debt service, that amount allocated to our unfunded liability within PERS, as that was sort of in our mind, how to direct that funding so as to reduce the term of the PERS liability and therefore reduce the overall cost. And I think Fred had looked at it at 10 years and 5 years and how could we get that done? Now, do we pivot based on the fact, the new information we have? We certainly could. What you'll hear is the debt service we're looking for is about $90 million over the next 5 or so years. So far greater than what's coming off. You had a second part of the question. Debt covenants. Based on how he's run it, our coverages will be fine. As you know, 125% minimum. I think the board policy is 200% coverage. Would be fine, but that's when it gets out into those years 3, 4, 5 after this budget cycle of what rate increases will be necessary to maintain those coverages. And that's sort of the decision point, just what you said.
Good, thank you.
Okay.
With that, I mean,
Great, perfect. So I'm going to just walk through the committee kind of, and we'll have a more detailed review at the budget study session, but I'm going to kind of just walk through the committee, basically the attachment today, kind of just page by page. So the first page in the attachment, it's called Monterey 1 Water Budget - Fund Summary, is basically on the wastewater fund. So basically what I did with this, it's kind of like what Paul talked about earlier. I assumed the incorporation of about $90 million of bond-funded CIP in this. There's some proposed staff changes, which I'll talk about a little bit in the report, that are incorporated into as well too. It incorporates and we did a 2-year budget on this for part of the reason you talked about earlier, because we wanted to see, kind of what the rate increases the effects would be over the 2 years, and if we needed to pivot. So it reflects the increase of about, I think it's about 16% in the rate for 24-25 for residential, from $44 to $50.95 a month. And then in 25-26 going from $50.95 to $54. So it does reflect those increases. What I did do on this scenario, like Paul was saying earlier, our operating expenses have been going up quite a bit. On average, the last few years, it's actually been about 14%. A lot of it has to do with what Paul talked about earlier, power, chemicals. They've dramatically gone up, during especially the pandemic. We've really had to, we've been able to successfully manage it during our current budget, but it's definitely a challenge, for going forward. And obviously, our new director, of engineering has as Paul mentioned earlier too, he's relooked at CIP, and those costs that we're looking at for CIP are substantially higher than what we initially had, in the earlier versions of the budget. So it's kind of like what Paul was saying. If you look at basically where we think our operating reserves and our capital reserves are going to be for the next couple of years for 24-25 and 25-26, we're in relatively good shape. So we were able to meet the 50% operating reserve, that the board had established a few years ago as our policy. And we're at about 10% for our capital reserve as well too. So it's really good news for, the next 2 years in essence. And our bond coverage ratios are over 200%. For both of those years, and that's in excess of the minimum, kind of the recommended reserve in our debt policy. The issue becomes more in the out years, in like Paul was saying, basically 26, 27 to 28, 29. I hadn't really done this approach in the past, but I wanted to go out future years because of the fact that we really have to, we're looking at a significant amount of CIP and bond financing that CIP and what the effects of that was going to be on the future years. So it does become an issue. You can see in those last 2 years, our bond coverage ratio drops below 200% in both of those years. That assumes that basically we bond finance about $90 million in debt. This scenario I had assumed, because I wanted to try to keep the rate increases, in the single digit area. So I assumed a rate increase of about 9% each year. Now, if we wanted to do the 90 million, do that all through bond financing, in order to keep at our bond coverage ratio at over 200%, that average increase would need to be about 13% a year. So just to kind of, and then on the flip side, Bill was talking about this earlier, if we wanted to just keep our debt service pretty much the same, going forward, we'd have to, and Paul mentioned this earlier too, we'd have to drop our CIP, bond funded CIP by about $60 million. And in that case, the rate of increase would only be about 8% a year. So obviously it does make a significant difference, as far as those rate increases. And like the committee was saying earlier, I think this is going to be some good discussion points for when we have our budget study session. So before I go on to the next page, is there any questions on the fund summary page for wastewater? Okay, so then the next page I'm going to turn over to is basically the revenue summary for wastewater. So like I said, this forecast right here incorporates our rate increases that we have approved through 25-26, and then basically going out at about 9% a year for the remaining 3 years as well too. So some of these you can see we keep relatively flat. They may go up slightly, but we wanted to be a little bit conservative, in our revenue estimates. One of the things you'll notice is that penalties and liens do drop, and this results because we're going to the property tax roll. The delinquency rate with the county is lower, so we're expecting obviously a reduction in penalties as well too. Like I said, the other fees we looked at historical trends and just being a little bit conservative, but pretty much keeping flat for those future years as well too. The good thing is I should point out on interest. We've been able to take advantage of a rise in interest rates the last couple of years, so those have gone up a bit compared to what we've had in the past. So, and the board will see the investment report at June's meeting as well too. So I'm going to flip to get to the next page, Chai, just on operating expenses. So this you can see we basically have broken out into 3 different areas. Our administration departments, those can consist of, administration, employee services, finance, IT, and outreach. We did break out for this year. This is a new breakout. The stormwater activities. We thought for reporting, because we work with several different entities for our stormwater activities, and we thought it'd be easier just to break out that activity as a separate department. So that part's being broken out from outreach starting in 24-25. The other new thing we kind of did this year as well too, for the contingency, we thought it'd be more transparent to break out the contingency into 2 parts. So there's an operating contingency part, and per our policy, that's 5% of operating expenses. And then there's basically a capital contingency, and that represents 10% of all of our capital items. So it includes this 10% of the CIP, capital outlay, and capital major maintenance as well too. And then Chai, the next page. So Matt's been working hard and has been very busy. He's put together a very extensive, working with Paul, very extensive capital improvement program, and actually on this has ranked the different capital projects and kind of come up with estimated costs for the next 5 years. In the final budget, we'll have a 10-year CIP as well too, but this represents kind of the 5 years. One of the new things we've done for this year in working with Matt is when we've looked at the future years, we've incorporated basically an ENR, which is basically the engineering news record construction cost index, into future years to better reflect what we think those future costs are going to be in future years. So that's a new kind of twist that we did for this year's CIP budget. We think it better reflects kind of what our total CIP is going to be over those 10 years. And when we have the budget study session, Matt will probably go into more detail on a lot of these different projects, but you can see pretty extensive list. One of the big things we're working on right now are the 2 pump stations for Paul, I think it's Seaside, Monterey. Is that right? Okay. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So that would be definitely, if we're looking at bond financing, that's the one project I had assumed we were going to bond finance because it is pretty significant and we're already undertaking it. The other projects would be obviously, discussions with Paul and the board as to ultimately kind of what we'd want to do on that. But you can see it's a pretty extensive list. So, for right now for 24-25, we have about 12 million of capital projects in the plan. It goes up to, by 26-27, 56 million. I mean, so it's we have a lot going on and just a lot of needs at the plant. So, and Matt's really helped to identify a lot of these.
In reference to the MOPS or Monterey and Seaside Pump Station, you remember we brought it to the board. It far more expensive than we thought. It's about round numbers, $35 million over the next 3 years. So that's a significant portion of our capital project. When we do a bond issuance, we need to designate which projects it's going to. So hence the reason, Fred's looking at all of the items and picking ones out that make the budget work over the time frame we're talking.
That's exactly it. And then
I think Bill had a question.
oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
No big deal. Scroll back down just a little bit, Chai. What is was it BRE? I can't scroll this down. The BRE rating, go to the top of this page that you're on. Chai.
Oh,
there you go. BRE risk. Is that just a risk factor?
yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
It's got a 96% chance of failing, or is it?
No, so it's a combination of
Seen it before.
consequence and risk of failure and consequence of failure.
Okay, gotcha.
So if my fork were to fail and has 100%, well, the consequence isn't that big a deal.
Right.
Well, to me it is, but for the agency it's not. Whereas a pump station, if it has a 50% chance of failing, but the consequence is, exactly. Hence the reason you come up with these blended scores.
Okay, cool. That's just what I wanted.
What's the bottom and top of that score scale?
It is, well, generally speaking, it's 0 to 100.
Okay.
So you calculate it out and then you normalize it to a 0 to 100 scale.
Okay. Thank you.
And it's one of the biggest factors used. You'll see in the column just to the right of that priority ranking. That's a big factor that's used when Matt goes to kind of rank these different projects as well too.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Bill, because I think going back 20 years, we didn't look at it, the industry didn't necessarily look at it from just a risk perspective, consequence of failure, probability of failure. And then there's another third factor of redundancy. So if my fork fails, if I have a second fork over here, not a big deal. But that same risk that we're talking about, Tom, goes into what projects come off the end. So if the board says, no, we don't want to do $90 million in debt, reduce everything by 60, we'll start looking at what is lower, could have the lower impacts to this agency and its service, and push those off the 10-year plan. So that's exactly how we would do it.
Thank you.
And then Chai, if you can go to the next page. So the next page, basically, this is our proposed, so we also do a 5-year kind of capital plan for IT as well too. And so Frank's taken a great detailed look, at kind of what upcoming needs we have in IT. A lot of it just obviously our infrastructure, cybersecurity. One of the big things too, we're going to be looking to replace our current accounting system. So our vendor basically is ending support by 2027. So we're envisioning starting in early 2025. And possibly even a little earlier than that. We'll see how it goes. But I'm basically looking for a new accounting system at that point. So, that's the RFP for the new accounting system by far is the biggest thing on here. Frank's added some additional things for cybersecurity. Obviously, that's an ongoing concern that we have to address as well too. There's some infrastructure for our servers that are looking to update. They're looking to do an update on the strategic plan for IT itself, which is kind of a 2-part project. And also in this boardroom itself, we're going to look to push off 1 year, but to basically kind of redo our boardroom here as well too. So Frank, I don't know, did you want to add anything about the 5-year CIP?
I'm available for any questions. Any clarifications on any of the?
What is the governance development project?
So that basically is, it's a design of how IT and the corporate strategy align together. So basically you set up various committees to make sure we're meeting the strategic objectives and values, and that IT isn't just doing IT stuff. That what we're doing is bringing strategic value to the organization.
But that sounds like it's fits within not so much routine, but fits within the costs of our staff. So what's $110,000 going towards?
That those had already been on the books, so we combined those and kept those in. These are also listed in terms of priority levels for us when you put them in there. There is a plan that we could potentially do that. Yeah. There's a strong possibility that we can roll that up into the strategic plan if we can word the RFP correctly, so that we want both projects to be included onto one.
Oh, so you're looking to spend some money on outside consultants on
Yes.
this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, the
got it.
outside consultants.
It's
Apologize.
plan development to make sure we're meeting these goals.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
CMMS system. So that's about 7 years old now, I think, roughly.
Yeah,
So they wear out about 10, 15, about 10 years is about their lifespan.
about
nowadays?
10 years is the general lifespan. Yeah.
Wow. That's some expensive stuff.
It is, and obviously, projecting out what the cost of a CMMS system or EAM system is going to be a few years. This is based on our best understanding at the point. And there's new capabilities in newer CMMS systems than our current system.
Would this be an upgrade of the current, or would this be a whole?
We would go out to RFP and determine and look at the various systems that were available at that time.
Yeah, because my experience on these things is what you spend on the program, you spend about 3 to 5 times implementing it.
Oh yeah,
Getting it up to speed and getting all the RFIDs and whatever you're going to do this time around. I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
no, it's definitely a large and expensive undertaking, and we are basically, for lack of a better term, stuck with what we picked for 10 years.
Okay.
And what's also nice, on that schedule is coming after the ERP upgrade. So make sure it integrates well,
That'd be good.
and we can have data going back and forth if necessary.
And maybe with accounting.
Yeah.
God forbid. And timesheets.
Yeah, that's a big part too, is the ability for all these systems to integrate with each other as well.
Thank you.
And then Chai, if you can go to the next page.
Thank you.
So these, we're not really proposing a lot of personnel changes for next year, but this basically highlights kind of the main ones that we're focusing on for the next couple of years. Again, because we're focusing on it as a 2-year item. So for IT, 2 different items. One is currently we have a part-time IT technician. Basically, we're looking to add a second part-time person so we can kind of have full coverage with that person between the 2 different sites. It's a relatively small cost. We're also looking to reclassify. We had funded already in the IT budget administrative support specialist. So we're the director of IT is proposing to reclassify this as a business systems architect. So the idea is that this person would kind of be in charge of, the administration of Laserfish, CMMS, GIS, and the ERP systems, because there's a lot of, as you can imagine, administration involved in all of those systems, basically. And it would include, obviously setting up report writers, workflows, and different types of support, and working with the vendors as well, too, as part of support. Employee services, they're looking to add an employee services technician. As you know, we're over now 100 employees. Once you get over 100 employees, the reporting and administrative requirements increase significantly. And so this is just designed to, assist the employee services department in kind of making sure we're meeting all the state, federal, and other types of mandates and reporting mandates going on. And engineering, as we've talked about earlier, we're looking at continued increase in the amount of, capital projects that we're doing. So they're looking to add an assistant engineer, starting to have this position start halfway in next year. And then also adding, they've had an intern, and I think they're looking to add an additional intern as well too. This really provides a lot of administrative support. It's a really win-win situation for all of our interns, because the person's coming in, get really good experience, and we get some relatively inexpensive administrative assistance in our different areas. For field maintenance, we're looking to defer these until 25, 26, but looking to add a couple of different senior mechanics and a mechanic in the second year. And then for pure water itself, we're looking to add 1 operator 3 this next fiscal year, I should say, in 24, 25. And then next year, with obviously expansion taking place, in 25, 26, that person would continue on. We would add additional second operator, 2 mechanics, and electrician and instrumentation tech as well too. So those are really the proposal. Oh, I should add as well too. In engineering, we're looking to upgrade. We have currently a construction inspector, electrician tech. We're looking to upgrade that position to a senior tech. So that's about $15,000. It's a relatively small cost, but their demands, obviously, with the CIPs continues to grow. So it just makes sense to have that position really better reflect their duties. So the impacts of those for the wastewater fund is about $400,000 for 24, 25. And obviously full year effect is about 1.2 million in 25, 26. And for pure water, the impact is about 200,000 for 24, 25, and about 900,000 for 25, 26.
And if I may, obviously the pure water costs hit the pure water fund, so they're not going to be reflected in our wastewater fund, and the cost and the rate increases projected, but we do have increases to the cost of water moving forward based on these suggestions.
So a couple of questions. First, to follow up on what Paul just said. I assume in our water purchase agreement, we were smart enough to include the ability to increase the cost of water. But what do we need in order to justify that under the agreement to prove to Cal-Am so they can take a rate case to the CPUC, et cetera, et cetera.
So it is truly the rate case to increase the cost of water thus far has just been a tier 2 advice letter. So not anywhere near as extensive as a tier 1 that requires more of a hearing. The tier 2 advice letter backup, frankly, is our budget. So when we start adding positions like this, generally what we have is some sort of explanation of why a position is needed. The job description is already established, and then the roll up of the budget, which Fred does. And that's provided to both Water Management District and Cal-Am. And frankly, I'm not sure who Cal-Am's rate person is now. Have you been dealing with anyone over
It's,
there? Or?
there's somebody he was asking about, so I don't have it with me,
Okay.
Paul, but yeah.
I just know it's changed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, obviously, the board wants to make sure that costs for Pure Water Monterey don't inadvertently slip over onto our ratepayers.
absolutely.
And then could you go back up to the top of this particular slide? I guess sometimes our job as directors is to ask hard to answer questions. So just warning you, I'm about to ask you a hard to answer question. We, generally speaking, we collectively, Monterey One Water, businesses, personal folks, et cetera, adopt information technologies, at least in part, because they substitute for old ways that involved humans that you had to pay. So technically, you would expect your IT to do a good job one of two ways: reducing some of your costs because you no longer need somebody to do some old manual paper-based process, or in some cases, you get a better product for your ratepayers out of that IT system. So it does seem a little bit sort of contradictory that we need additional IT support when the IT system's supposed to be saving us in terms of personnel costs for IT. So I'm just wondering if there's a good explanation for that. And sort of a follow-up, if we currently have a 24-hour-a-week part-timer and we're talking about hiring another 24-hour-a-week part-timer, that's a 48-hour. Could we get the same job done, maybe at a little less cost with one full-timer? Subsidiary question.
Frank, do you want to get both those? Or you want me to chime in?
Sure, I'll take both.
Okay.
So, what we did is we looked at the skills that we had within information technology, information services here. And one of the big gaps that we have was identified with this position to fill. So that's going to be like the application support, as Fred mentioned. We have a new ERP system coming in. We have potentially a CMMS replacement. We have the GIS system, which we don't have anybody who actively supports that on a day-to-day basis. So this really fills that gap, especially as we talk about programming interfaces between the potential systems. So, and previously we, as the administrative support specialist we had, this person would take over those responsibilities as well, with integrating Laserfish, our document management system, more into our daily workflows, getting all of our old paper records from storage into an electronic system. And then the idea of a part-time is it provides a service to the community, to generally college students, and it allows us, for a very low cost, to have like that initial help if it's just a very simple IT task. Previously, a lot of support would fall to one person is doing everything, and we just didn't get time to work on some of these projects.
So is the cost of two part-timers less than one full-timer?
Yes, from the standpoint of, well, two things. One is with the two part-timers, one can be at RTP, one can be here to help out.
Right.
Second thing, without the PERS and benefit costs, we can get
okay.
someone at a much lower
Yeah.
rate
Right, right. Okay,
and provide experience, as Frank was mentioning.
thank you.
I'm good. I'm good.
Good.
And then, Chai, if we can go to the last page. So, and we were just talking about this, just a minute ago as well too. So basically, we just wanted to kind of show you the impact of what we're envisioning the rates to be for pure water. As you know, we provide water, our recycled water to two different entities, the Marina Coast Water District and to, it's basically a combination, the Water Management District in Caliam. So let me talk about Caliam first, and then I'll go into the Water Management District, or sorry, Marina Coast. So the Water Management District, Caliam. So I ran two different scenarios. One, basically, if we didn't add that additional employee that I mentioned earlier, the rate increase would be about 9% for next year. So our current rate right now is $37.93 per acre foot. And that's proposed to go up. It would go up 9% without an additional employee. It would go up 11% with the additional employee. So, go ahead, Paul. Yeah,
For 24, 25, is that only the one additional employee? Because everything else was deferred. to
that's
20
exactly it, right? Because we'll have a new rate for 25, 26 with expansion, obviously the increased production at that point. So this is only for the one additional employee. Yeah.
Okay.
And just as so they're all based for the Water Management District, assumed production of the 3,700 acre feet for them. Just as a reference note for 22, 23, we were able to exceed that a bit. We produced almost 4,200 acre feet in that year. So we were able to add some additional amounts in the reserve. But that's basically the proposed rate for next year, we're assuming with the one additional employee of the 42.18 per acre foot. So Marina Coast, I have to explain a little bit because it's a pretty substantial increase for them. So when we did the rates for 23, 24, it was assumed per their agreement that we were going to be producing about 600 acre feet for them. Our production's been a lot less. The needs at the golf course has been a lot less than initially was in the agreement. So just to give you an idea, for 22, 23 on a calendar year basis, we produced a little bit over 400 acre feet for them. So I wanted to be more realistic when we came up with the rate for them in essence, for 24, 25. So instead of it being based upon 600 acre feet, it's now based upon 400 acre feet in essence. So that's why there's a dramatic jump in their rate from the 23.46 for, in essence, this fiscal year to 38.25. It'd be 38.25 without any additional employees, 39.06 with the one additional employee.
So am I correct in assuming that if Marina Coast's consumption went up to 600, that rate per acre foot would be a little different and lower, presumably lower?
Well, and that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So what would happen is if we actually ended up producing 600 acre feet, as part of the reconciliation, we would say, oh, okay, great. Yeah, we produce more. Obviously, the cost per acre foot would be a lot less. And then that would be reflected in next year's rate as kind of a partial offset for that rate. Yeah, Paul, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I mean, if that were to occur, then plus or minus their effective rate would be in the $2,600 per acre foot range.
Okay. And you didn't say this, but I think I know the answer. And certainly other directors of the public might say, well, why is Marina Coast's wholesale rate less than Cal-Am's? Well, a couple of reasons. Cal-Am's not a part owner of Monterey One Water to begin with, but more importantly, we have a different agreement that was negotiated many, many years ago about how to calculate those rates.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that point because there's specific cost per the agreement that are exempted from, in essence, when you look at the pool of costs to be charged to them.
Right.
For example, I think the injection wells is one of them, if I remember right. There's a couple different ones. And so, yeah, we basically have to kind of look at two different cost base when we calculate each one of their rates.
Yeah, the primary difference is the injection wells. I mean, other than that, the costs for Cal and Marina Coast are identical going through the plant. It's just that additional service of injection wells.
Thank you.
That's good.
And with that, that basically concludes my presentation. Paul, I don't know if you had any final comments.
Just, I would like to hear some discussion, if possible, on that dilemma, if you will, of debt issuance versus reduction of capital projects. Certainly we'll bring back what those impacts are, with the understanding that Fred is assuming 9% increases in the out years, which are significant. We understand that, but they would just have to be that much greater. What'd you say, 13%?
13%, Paul, yeah. Mhm.
In order to meet those capital needs that have been identified. If there's any thoughts, direction, it'd be helpful.
I mean, looking back historically, I don't want to go back to the Lou days cash and carry. I don't want to go back to never raising the rates. I think that's got us where we're at in a large part. I'm not totally comfortable with wholesaling out debt either, but maybe a hybrid. Maybe some debt and some reduction, but really balanced and really research to make sure we're not cutting off our foot by not fixing a pump station or a pipeline because we don't have the money versus, you know, like I said, I don't want to just go out whole hog and float a ton of bonds and then trap ourselves into debt for the next zillion years. But we also have to get this stuff fixed up. I mean, I'm seeing stuff from Monterey pump station. I'd love to look and see what you're doing over there because I know what it was like when I left. And it was getting scary then, and it's 7 years later. So I think some kind of a hybrid model, and maybe, I don't know how hard it would be, Fred, to put together some, you know, if we did all bonds, it would be this much. If we did all CIP reduction to be this much, and then kind of funnel it into a middle ground.
Yeah, what we'll do when we do the budget study session, we'll kind of show you, I mean, I kind of had handwritten notes just to prepare for the meeting, but we'll show as slides, kind of a couple different scenarios, basically. And I'll work with Matt to kind of be able to show you, okay, yeah, if certain projects are cut, like you guys were talking about, basically, what's the impact, you know, in essence, yeah.
Well, it's not through the chair. I agree, but would like to add something to this. It's not that we're cutting projects and we're never going to do that project. It's pushing that project down the timeline a bit. So yeah, absolutely. I think we need to find out what the risks of these delays are likely to be. And there's two areas where there could be risks. One is the real risk of premature failure, and then you're faced with corrective rather than preventive maintenance. And corrective maintenance is always far more expensive than preventive maintenance. But you're also facing the risk of inflation, which is very hard to predict. And so those costs could go up. But the piece somehow I'd like to see added is comes from the struggle that board members, and I've personally gone through this on a number of occasions, between debt financing for capital improvement of the future versus raising the rates now. I think you call that cash and carry, so to speak, because they treat current and future ratepayers a bit differently. You know, for somebody old, if I ever get there, I would be in favor of the debt financing, because by the time the debt comes due, I may very well not be around, right? But on the other hand, doing it now, you know, so that's kind of harmful to the younger generations. On the other hand, a lot of old folks are on fixed incomes and struggle particularly with higher cost of living here on the California coast. As beautiful a place it is to live, it's expensive. And raising your rates immediately to do more cash and carry has an impact on the older folks, right? So there's no right or easy answer. And I do agree that we probably need to try and find some spot in the middle. on this.
And you brought up a good point, Chair. I'm just having Chai bring up the CIP slide that we have in the packet as well too, because we've been able to in the past pretty much pay as you go, as we do our CIP budgets. But you can kind of see with this 5-year, I mean, if we were trying to pay this basically all with rates, it's just not feasible. I mean, you can look at the 1 year in particular in 26, 27, $56 million for us to try to fund that just with rate increases. I mean, we'd be barbecued. So, I mean, we just,
But isn't,
It's a balance, like you said, Tom,
Yeah.
because we still want to maintain our debt covenants. We have reserve policy we're trying to meet as a good financial agent. And we have a lot of projects. So it's not just dumping it on the future generations. It's also making sure we're financially healthy now into perpetuity.
right,
So
right.
it is, but we can certainly bring back the two main levers we have. Well, three main levers: rate increases, debt financing, reducing capital, because that's where you get your bang for your buck.
and the nice thing about debt financing too is it basically spreads the cost over the useful life of those improvements as well too. So there's kind of a one-to-one correlation. That's obviously why a lot of debt financing is done, on major infrastructure projects, because they do have long-term benefits.
But
So
burdens your ratepayers with a lot of future costs.
it does.
It does.
Unless we go back to 5 years ago when we could get bond financing for 1%. Hey, that's great. I'll hold my breath.
The other part of the equation, I think that we have to factor in, and Paul mentioned it earlier, is the secondary costs of failure. If you lose something at the plant, if you lose the heat to the digesters, that's a big deal because you're going to lose the digesters, but you're not spilling on the ground. Sick digesters are no fun and they're nasty. But you lose Monterey pump station, you lose Seaside pump station. Besides the cost of fixing the pump station, literally potentially millions of fines for spilling into the marine sanctuary. So all that stuff kind of has to be pulled together into the matrix to figure out, your risk reward. I mean, it's pretty simple. The only other question I would have is if we did $50 million in CIP or whatever, do we have the staff to handle it? Because that's been an issue in the past.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason we are looking at adding some engineering staff, and in talking to Matt and Tammy, bringing consultants where necessary, because we see you don't want to staff up for the peaks. You want to staff up for what's steady state for the next 10, 20 years, and then shave the peaks with consultants that can move on. So
Looks like Matt wants to say something.
Yeah, Paul, if I may add, I want to second some of the comments made by Director Cronin. Many of these, I'll start by saying that many of these projects are associated with the regional treatment plant and the original sewage pump stations, all of which are approaching 34 years old. A lot of these facilities are approaching the end of their useful life. And these capital projects are designed to extend the useful life of these facilities, minimize our maintenance burden, and to minimize our agency's liabilities. So some of those are difficult to quantify, but there is a business case to be made. For example, if you take a project off the list, it will likely significantly increase our maintenance burden. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as we contemplate reduction of the capital program going forward.
Thank you, Matt. Tyler.
If I could jump in, and apologies for my tardiness here, but I think it's a good discussion going on. And how do you weigh all these? Obviously, I'm looking at this from the perspective of long-term sustainability of the agency. And so in as much as we can avoid debt financing, I think that's a good goal, but I also understand the balance and the need to make sure that we can take care of the infrastructure now, because what are the implications if the system fails? So it's a balance, but how do we set ourselves up for success so that as we're doing the debt financing, we're thinking about making sure that we're continuing to set funding aside in our reserve funds to ensure the sustainability of these systems long-term into the future. So just a insight there that I know everybody in the room kind of preaching to the choir here a little bit.
And if I may, through the chair. I'm sure you guys all know this, but because the regional plant and the original pump stations were all mostly grant funded, the rates that were set after the regional treatment plant came online were artificially low.
Mm.
Because you had basically a free treatment plant. And now most treatment plants, they float a bunch of bonds, whatever, to get the thing built. When the bonds were out, the plants were out, you reissue them, you just keep moving it down the road. So they had this big chunk of life, 10 years, 12 years we went without a rate increase, wasn't it?
12.
12 years in a row, 14 out of 17, no rate increase.
So you had this long period of time where we didn't put any money in a sinking fund in the bank, in a capital repair replacement fund or anything else. So the previous management of the agency maybe wasn't set up very well, and we're kind of held with now kind of picking up those pieces. So eventually, theoretically, if we do bond issuance and rate increases, at some point, we'll get to that balance point that when the pump that we bought with the bond is worn out, the bond is paid for, you buy another bond, you buy another pump or a building or whatever.
Or you've saved up to replace
Or
it.
you have, yeah, you start doing a capital fund, sinking fund, there's different ways to look at it. But that was one of the problems I saw many, many years ago is we just never, they never moved beyond this. Well, we got this free treatment plant, Golio. We can charge $12 a month for sewer service or whatever.
Well, and this goes into our talking points when we're speaking with our ratepayers as well, right? Because we're gonna be doing the rate study next year, and you can already imagine that people are going to be frustrated and upset because we've been increasing it over the last 5 years, and we're going to continue to do that. But how do we express to them, look, we're trying to pull all the levers here to try to right the ship. So it's a tough conversation.
Yeah.
Did we pass a chair back to Tyler? Or are you still, okay, so.
I would have him stay.
Okay.
At this point.
If I may, so what I'm hearing is take a look at the hybrid approach of bond financing as well as some potential reductions over the 10-year time frame, more particularly, I guess, the 5-year that Fred has put up here. I'm going to throw another option on the table, because if we say we need a $90 million issuance based on the capital needs, it is sort of requiring future boards to cover that debt service, presumably by rate increases. Future board could also cut the capital projects later on, which is fine. But my option is maybe we bring to the table, instead of a $90 million bond issuance, a $20 million bond issuance in year 2, and a $40 million in year 6, and another $30 million in year 9, to distribute that $90 million over the time frame. Certainly, we all know that issuance costs and bond attorneys and all that will be greater when you do that, but it does allow some flexibility for future electeds to make the decisions when the time comes.
And maybe we get lucky and catch lower rates.
Well, that was certainly something Fred and I have talked about, is let's do this first one smaller with the assumption the Fed reduces rates through the following year. But it's something else we can look at in terms of options to bring to the board.
Again, apologize for being late, and so I don't have my pulse right on the conversation that was happening when I was walking in the door. But one thing I wanted to check in with staff on was trying to get a sense of our investment portfolio. How does that work? Who manages that? Who has access to that? What does that look like for us? How do we manage that?
So, yeah, so we have basically, it's kind of a couple different prong approach that we have to it. So US Bank is our primary, bank that we use for basically for just all of our checking transaction and all that. So what we've done during the past year, we've enabled a sweep account with them basically. So it kind of maximizes our return, on funds that we hold with them. The rate on that is approximately about 5% right now. And then for our other monies that are not needed like right away, basically, we have a couple of different investment vehicles, a few different ones we take advantage of. So we have some monies in the county pool. We have some in LAIF. We have some in what's called a camp. A camp is another kind of alternative to LAIF as well too. And then as a requirement for our current purchasing card, we have a $5 million money market with BMO as well too. So they all earn between about 4 to 5%. So very competitive right now. We're actually getting pretty good rates of return. Right now, the market is still such that the shorter term rates are for the most part higher than the longer term rates. Now that will eventually flip to where you have more a U-shaped curve. So in the future, when we look at that, we may look at, in the past where I've worked at before, we've used some different investment advisors. For example, Camp, their main advisor is called PFM. And so they work with more longer term securities. So when that market starts to turn a little bit, which I imagine it will in the future, we'll probably look to invest some, at least in some longer term investments.
And Fred,
Yeah.
the other part of Tyler's question is account access to everything. I know in the past I had access and I had, what was it? The token?
The
that
token,
would
yeah.
give you an ongoing pass.
So what we have right now to kind of just make it flexibility wise, myself, Taya, who is our new
we should-
controller as well too. She will, I have to set her up, but she will probably the next week or so. Will have access. We also have a couple of our accountants too. So we have some flexibility in who can. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
So, so Taya and then
Like Andrea and
I didn't
Thing
realize.
as well too. Yeah. And
I
then
just knew they
also-
booted me off all the accounts. So I wasn't sure
Probably
what
for the
happened
best,
there.
actually.
and also Chai as well too, because we wanted to have enough flexibility when we do that. So
Well, Taya, welcome aboard. Glad to have you here.
You want to take this moment to introduce Taya? Fred?
Absolutely,
Is that
yeah.
okay? Can we take a
So,
second?
Taya, if you don't mind just coming up here just for a second. So, Taya is our new controller. She's been with us. This is starting the third week, right? Third week, yeah, exactly. So she's a native to our area. And
Oh, can you guys get to the microphone?
yeah, I'm sorry.
Both
Yeah,
of you?
She's a native to our area. She's worked for a couple different nonprofits here in the Monterey area. And she was actually a finance director before at her previous position, and so has lots of good experience. And she's really excited about working here as well too. Just all that we do for our area. So Taya, I don't know if you want to have a couple words.
Sure.
My
name is Tea. Nice to meet you all. My name is Tea Yanks, and I worked previously for Gateway Center of Monterey County in Pacific Grove. And I'm extremely happy to be here and to be part of the Monterey One team.
Welcome.
Welcome indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that.
So I've never thought to ask this before, but is it possible for a director to get read-only access to some of those accounts?
We can. I mean, yeah. I mean, maybe that might be something I just have them work with you, Paul. I mean, if there's we can set up read-only access if desired. Yeah.
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 And because I'm thinking at another agency I worked at, we had PFM do all of our investments, and there was an online portal we could all look at. So there's got to be something like that we can do from a read-only perspective here.
We could. The only thing I would just say for the board, we can definitely. That's one of the reasons, though, we do provide the monthly.
Right. You do report it.
You guys have kind of all that information, but we could, if there's such a desire, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
No, I'm good, sir.
Hey, you got enough on that item?
We do. Yeah. Well, thank you for all your input, and we'll come back with kind of a presentation at the budget study session in May.
All right, move on to item 8. Consider recommending approval of the resolution declaring intention to reimburse expenditures relating to wastewater.
Yeah, this is basically the idea behind this resolution is so that as we're starting our projects, such as, environmental reviews, planning, all that stuff, those costs that we incur before the issuance of the bond, we need to have a resolution in place that basically says, we are looking to issue bonds so that we can, when we go to issue the bonds, we can go back and pay, reimburse ourselves for those previous costs incurred for the projects. So for this report, we basically just did a preliminary identification of some key projects that we thought would be financed through the bonds. Obviously, we wanted to kind of hear from the committee and then from the board as to what specific ones they'd want us to bond finance. So our thought would be basically when we do the budget study session, we'll get more input from the board as to kind of what what amount and what projects they'd like us to look to bond finance. And then we'll bring it back at one of the June board meetings for board approval at that point. But this is the idea of just basically for the committee to recommend for the board, yes, we'd like to take this step. And then after board discussion, we'll finalize what that amount would be for bond financing and what specific projects as well too. And Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. So, okay.
Oh, you see where the 90 million gets to and how it's distributed over the time frame. We will cut it up to see how we can do it over time to try to address some of the issues that you've all talked about.
So you're looking really today more for conceptual approval.
Of what you've seen thus far in terms of the standing expenses, revenues, the personnel additions, and the potential future costs for Pure Water, which we're getting over to water management.
Oh,
It's appropriate, I'll move that we agree to that. I'm not sure how to phrase it exactly.
no, not either.
Give staff permission to move forward with what we talked about. Is that what you mean?
But, and then, I'm sorry.
I was just seconding it so we don't have it die.
No other comments? We've got a first motion and second. Did we ask the public for any comments on this? Don't see any. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimous. Move on to item 9, staff reports.
So just a couple quick things. One is Rachel and I just got back on Wednesday night, and I'm actually going to ask her to talk about it because I've probably forgotten most of it by now. We did a quick trip to Washington, D.C., and with our lobbyists had a number of meetings Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, primarily talking about pure water expansion, sometimes the needs of the treatment plant as a whole, and then, of course, the renewable energy project with Regen, which was people were very interested in that. So, Rachel, would you mind providing some detail to that?
Yeah, so good afternoon. Despite Paul bringing an empty carry-on, we did not come home with lots of bills. But we did have a really productive trip.
And I would tell you if we did, by the way.
We did have a really productive trip and a number of really positive conversations, both up on the Hill with our representatives and with federal agencies. In addition to the topics that Paul mentioned, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. We also did talk about PFAS. So today, as we're thinking about our future and our budget, one thing we haven't talked about is any potential regulations that may come down from the federal government related to that now forever chemical, and how we as a passive receiver will have responsibility within our community to help those who have been utilizing that chemical, which can be found in this carpet, in our bodies, in the food you eat, everywhere, in the cleanup response. So not a 4-letter word that we like to bring up in any of those conversations. And Paul and I, in every single conversation, you're having these really positive, everyone's excited about the innovative work. You know, we walk into reclamation and they know us there. They know us at the Department of Interior. But, you know, we'd always weigh whether you bring up that 4-letter word, and in some of those meetings we did. And so they recognize, especially I would say at the UPA and at US EPA and Senator Padilla's office, that it is going to be a challenge and something that we as communities need to budget for. They still have a lot to work through. So I want to assure you that we will be monitoring this from both a regulation standpoint, an impact to us as an agency, as a community, and then every funding opportunity that we can possibly pursue to help mitigate any changes we have to make.
While we were back there, the rule dropped in the Federal Register. Hence the reason it was on everyone's mind at that particular moment. And then you also know the implementation date of July 8th or whatever it is.
Yes,
So,
July
And by the way, Rachel, you're supposed to not end on a negative. So maybe you say something different.
Okay, yes, but we had really positive conversations. They introduced some new avenues of funding that we can consider. We had really great conversation with WIFIA, who is funding our expansion of Pure Water Monterey through the loan. And I mean, they're jazzed. I will tell you, as we go back there, if we want to end on a positive note, it is so fun to be back there and tell our story and watch the look on people's face change as they hear about the innovative things coming out of our relatively small community. They're looking to make us a model that is going to be replicable throughout the entire United States. And here we are coming in with, our 100 employees and our 280,000 community members. And they're looking to replicate this in Dallas and New York and these huge metropolitan areas. So it's really exciting and appreciative of the opportunity that we were able to find time to make that happen this year.
So I just want to make sure I understand, you have been, even though it sort of puts a damper on some conversations, expressing our concern that as a passive receiver of PFAS contaminated materials, our concern is that we will burden our ratepayers with treating that, whereas the companies that created these chemicals sold them for a profit, but failed to charge enough to deal with the downstream contamination processes will walk away scot-free. Is that sort of the way in which we express this concern to the government?
I think in essence, there are obviously some settlements going on with some of the producers, the 3Ms of the world. So there's, they're not scot-free, but it's a small fraction of what the cleanup costs will be.
Right. We'll get a check for $25 or $30. I've been party to those class action settlements before, and I've certainly been able to buy lunch.
And something
A PFAS laden lunch too.
PFAS laden lunch.
Something I found really interesting as we were having our very last conversation before up on the hill before heading in our Uber to the plane was actually this balance. We have had such a focus as an industry on being a passive receiver and various impacts that that's going to have, that we have maybe spent a little bit less time focusing and showing exactly what it's going to take to remedy and help contribute to removing PFAS from our environment. And so that's a strategy. Paul and I are going to do some debriefing next week and some follow-up. One of the things I really want to start thinking about is, well, we still obviously need to stay active on the front of trying to work with our representatives and are hopeful that there can be bipartisan bipartisan legislation related to some kind of, we need to rebrand this word waiver or exemption, but some kind of carve out for passive receivers. Also want to be starting to work on our response plan and the impact this could have on an agency like this. And going back actually to how you weigh, when we look at capital and you weigh both like the odds of this happening and then the impact of if it does happen, we need to start doing that related to PFAS, right? Because some of the things we started to hear was like, oh, there's only, a small percentage that is going to, somebody's actually going to sue you. Okay, but if there's a small percentage, but then the impact is on that scale, a 90, we need to be helping them understand what's that blended risk look like. So we're kind of starting to shift, I think, a little bit from focusing just on the passive receiver and more to that blended risk, like you're looking at in the capital plan.
And we're trying to do this at the same time that regulations are being developed. So we're not exactly sure what the landscape looks like. So we did, as Rachel mentioned, pivot to what are the costs we know, like biosolids. Well, you know what? We know those costs are going up. We need to do something with it. We're looking at studies in reference to the recycled water and what potential impacts there are on ag as well as drinking. And then something that came up in the middle of one of our meetings. I forget who said it. It's the guy from
Water use.
Oh, that's
Greg
right.
said it. Yeah.
What are you guys going to do with your membranes? End of 7 years, membranes aren't any good, you replace them. We've built that into the project. We didn't build in having to dispose of them as hazardous waste.
And follow that stream forever.
Mhm.
And it was like, and then what are the implications thereafter? So this is evolving.
Yes.
And, I know the legislators are just sick and tired of people like us coming in saying we're passive receivers and please give us an exemption. So one thing I'm going to advocate for is we work with a number of associations, water use, CASA, Aqua to a certain degree. We met with the executive director of NACWA, and I think on an issue such as this, being associated with an organization that does clean water stuff, meaning wastewater treatment plants that are dealing with this, I think may be prudent because of their legislative presence, because of their relationships with EPA throughout the organization. So I do want to look at that as well.
So along those lines, so far in our meetings, and of course the PFAS stuff is relatively new, at least being discussed at the board level. The only potential solid technical way to get rid of the stuff is pyrolysis. So question, do we know exactly what the ramifications of building a pyrolysis facility would be? What does it cost us in dollars? What would be its carbon impact? Is it driven by electricity or natural gas? Does anybody have I know there's a solar electric plant somewhere, I think in Arizona or New Mexico, that doesn't use photovoltaic, but has just a bunch of mirrors, which all follow the sun, but focus the reflected sunlight on a thing on a tower, generates a huge amount of heat. Could we do pyrolysis simply off of reflected sunlight and generate the temperature levels necessary and the rates appropriately? The other idea that it occurs to me is maybe we ought to contact somebody like the Environmental Defense Fund, because they do studies of environmental issues, and maybe they have something already on the books that they've done related to this, or maybe they'd be interested in supporting and partnering with us. And they do have money. I mean, they pay people to do environmental analyses. And this sounds, if we could present to the ratepayers, not just, hey, we're a passive receiver, give us a waiver, but hey, you don't want to give us a waiver? Here's a solution, but here are the costs.
So go ahead.
Sorry, I know that Matt wants to chat, but and provide information, but keep in mind the biosolids is one thing, and we've looked at the pyrolysis, et cetera, and Matt can speak more on that. But also the waste stream goes either to the ocean outfall without providing biosolids, and also goes to AWPF. So there would still be PFAS going through, and if you're only dealing with biosolids, you're only handling the solids aspect.
Agreed. There are waste streams that come off of Pure Water Monterey, including 7-year-old membranes that are now hazardous waste. Could they be dumped into a pyrolysis system? I don't know.
Matt, just a second.
Yeah.
So in reference to your first question, Tom, just once again at a high level, if you look at page 13 of the BPC, which has the capital improvement program. And in year 28-29, towards the bottom there, you have added biosolids drying and high temperature pyrolysis equipment. So it's something that Matt and staff have been looking at. And actually we have it, like I said, 28-29 for $4.7 million. It's not the whole thing, but it is on the radar. It's within the next 5 years. So
my point on this though is, sure, that's a dollar cost.
Yeah.
But what are the carbon impact? What are the other impacts, which would be something Rachel and Mike would want to present to government folks who might,
and we do have some of that. I mean, we've had a study done by all utilities that describes it.
Right.
Matt, do you want to chime in on some of those impacts and fuel use?
Yeah, if I may. I mean, this is also extensively discussed in some of the appendices to the recently presented renewable energy study by GHD. But what I want to emphasize is that the majority of the loading of PFAS ends up in our biosolids. So that has been a focus of ours. Mitigation for PFAS has been a focus of my research for several years now. There are a couple technologies out there, high temperature pyrolysis. There's also a new emerging technology called supercritical water oxidation, which essentially reduces the PFAS to mineral ash. It is end of the line for PFAS. These are very new, emerging, and rapidly developing technologies. They're also likely to be quite expensive. I would like to emphasize that although we talked about much of the capital improvement program being to replace aging equipment, we're going to do it in a way that sets the stage for us to mitigate for the PFAS that is present in our biosolids. Right now, the leading technology is high temperature pyrolysis. And what that means is you need to bring it up to at least 1900 degrees Fahrenheit. And the way they do that is they use the gas that is inherent in the biosolids. It's called syngas to fuel that process. And if done properly, because the biosolids has very high calorific value, you can do it without adding significant additional energy. In fact, the resulting byproduct, biochar, is a way to sequester carbon. So there's a way to actually, there's a net reduction in carbon with technologies like high temperature pyrolysis. This is why the one large high temperature pyrolysis installation in Redwood City is the subject of so much research by US EPA, because they recognize the great potential for technologies like this to be the end of the line for PFAS. Now, when it comes to water treatment, the state of the art for treatment of water streams, like, for example, recycled water, is to run that water through granular activated carbon to absorb the PFAS onto the carbon. Now, that begs the question, what do you do with the carbon? Well, you can regenerate the carbon by running it through the same high temperature pyrolysis process through which you treat the biosolids. So in my opinion, this is leading the industry towards having technologies like high temperature pyrolysis, not just here, but everywhere, which leads to another point that I'd like to make. Because we have some clarity about how to mitigate for PFAS, like we have done with Pure Water Monterey and other projects, I think if we could stay on the leading edge and move towards implementing this top technology, we have great opportunity to be a model of what the regulatory agencies want wastewater facilities like ours across the land to do, and to potentially greatly benefit from some grant funding opportunities. That's probably enough. I appreciate the opportunity to add.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Bill, you have
No, I'm good.
good?
I think we're on staff reports, right? Do
Okay.
you have any more?
No,
Yeah,
I'm
we're
good.
still
Okay.
I'm good. I
Report.
think.
I was trying to
I think
remember where
I
we
did
were.
enough.
So the only thing that I would like to share with you is that the maintenance and the operations teams, we basically fired up the dam. We raised the dam and we're using one pump right now, and we're working out the bugs. By the end of the day or first thing tomorrow, we should be all 3 pumps running. And so that's huge. As you guys know, we've been put off because of the flow of the river. And so we're happy to state that we're running the dam.
About committee member reports. We're good?
No comments, we're good.
Okay. Time. Do we have any public comments on our closed session item? Don't see any. Okay, we'll move into closed session then.
Negotiators.
Oh, Allison, can you
Yep.
start that again?
Yes, I'll start that out again. So just to announce, we're going into closed session on conference with labor negotiators, with all of the represented groups, agency representatives, the general manager, and the director of employee services. And now we can go into closed session. Reporting out from closed session, there is no reportable action.
right, thank you, Allison. And we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting.